Hello and welcome, dear friends and colleagues. Welcome to Thriving Media for Resilient Democracies, brought to you by Free Press Unlimited as part of the second Summit for Democracy here at The Hague in the Netherlands. I'm Nisha Pillai, and it's my great pleasure to be your moderator today. The first summit, you may recall, was convened by US President Joe Biden back in 2021, a couple of years ago. This, the second summit, is jointly convened, I should say, by a number of different countries: Costa Rica, Zambia, South Korea, the Netherlands, and the US. And it brings together, as part of this summit, a number of multi-stakeholder meetings, just like this one, with government representatives, representatives of the private sector, and civil society. We hope that you will find it really useful in furthering the agenda. And what is that agenda? The agenda of the summit. Why? It's to celebrate and put right in the center of our thinking the importance of a well-functioning democracy and free society. And there is no one better to introduce to us the importance of democracy and media, bringing them together. Where is the combination? Why do we need thriving media for a well-functioning democracy? There is no one better to do that for us than the Executive Director of Free Press Unlimited, Ruth Kronenburg. Please welcome Ruth Kronenburg.
Thank you, Nisha, for these very kind words. Good day to everybody here in the room, but also online. Thank you for joining us. Why are we gathered here? As Nisha rightly put it, we're here to preserve democracy. And sadly, that is necessary because authoritarian regimes are on the rise globally. But even within our own democracies, the very same values, the foundation of democracies, are eroded due to so-called legit excuses like anti-terrorism and pandemic measures, or because aggressive protesters, normal citizens, turn against their own governments, their democracies. So how can we then preserve democracies? We believe that we can only do that if media freedom is protected. Then democracies can flourish and thrive. And why is this true? Let's look at regimes where there is no media freedom whatsoever, for whatever reason. People there have to turn to one-side information directed by the state. It's biased. There is no room for criticism. People cannot express their opinion. If they do, they face imprisonment, or that can cost them their freedom or even their life. Journalists have to flee the country. Go on and go on. There is no room for public discourse on important matters like politics, war, climate change. We can continue. This is why we need to preserve democracy. Luckily, media are innovative and persistent. I know of maybe little and small initiatives, but they're so inspiring. Like a cross-border collaboration of journalists in Eastern and Central Europe in their fight against disinformation on and during the COVID-19 pandemic. They teamed up with science experts in order to increase the information, the medical information. And by doing that, they actually gave the people knowledge on COVID-19. And with that, they could resist the disinformation. So, for our democracies, we indeed believe that you need to protect the media, independent media, and we need a thriving media. Media that encourage the public debate, that creates a better understanding of the challenges of today. like climate change, like war, like conflicts in the world. Giving us all the facts and all the relevant information so that we can actually debate publicly what should be done. How this works, you will learn more this morning from our guest from Indonesia. Maybe a little forward or a very local example, but very inspiring, I would say. Or media that has found powerful and very encouraging ways to go against the repressive forces by defending their crucial role. We learn about that from our colleague from Nicaragua. All examples or best practices, if you like, that showcase that actually something can be accomplished. And we need those examples. And on top of that, at the end of this session, we will learn about more recommendations and best practices, also short, midterm and long-term goals from the working groups of the Media Freedom Cohort, all to create a more enabling environment for media, but also for democracies. So I call upon all of you, but especially on stage, to embrace these examples, to embrace the recommendations, to multiply them where possible, or put them in practice. And before we're going to start the session, I would like to end with the famous words of Thomas Jefferson. He said, back in the 18th century, "Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost." Thank you very much.
Wow, Ruth, really inspiring words there. That cannot be limited without being lost. The freedom of the press cannot be limited without being lost. I'm writing it down so that I never forget them. I didn't know them. Thomas Jefferson, he really had a way with words which meant something, eh? So we are now going to turn the spotlight onto positive initiatives. And you may well ask yourself, how can we talk about positive initiatives at a time like this when media freedom is so under threat? Well, we can. And now I'm going to introduce you to some speakers who's going to talk to us about small steps that they're taking to strengthen independent media's resilience despite democratic challenges. Let me introduce you to, from Nicaragua, Enrique Gasteazoro, Director of Communications and Engagement of Access Now. Please come on up. From Indonesia, Eddy Prastyo, Head of New Media of the Voice of Surabaya, a really progressive radio station. Eddy. And from Free Press Unlimited, Meera Chowdhury, who's the program lead for Latin America. Meera. So Enrique, if we could start with you. Have a sip of water first. So we don't often get to hear that much about what's going on in Nicaragua, except I am aware, and probably most people here, that politically things can be pretty challenging. So what does that mean for journalists and the media trying to report?
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I think that you're right. Nicaragua is often not on the agenda, yet there's lots that the rest of the world can learn from what has happened there over the last few decades. Very quickly, between 1990 and 2006, Nicaragua had a true spring for press freedom. After the war in the 1980s, journalism thrived. And we really thought that, slowly but surely, democracy would continue to improve in the country. In 2007, with the return of Daniel Ortega to power, we quickly started to find out that that was not the case. And during 10 years, between 2007 and 2017, Daniel Ortega had a very well-thought and thorough strategy to dismantle democracy in Nicaragua. There was an institutional aspect of it, which meant destroying pretty much the rule of law and taking over the entire state apparatus. There was an aspect which really teaches us that autocrats are very smart and learn. So unlike in the 80s, he built alliances with the business elite. He built alliances with the church. He built alliances with the international community that was all too happy with the stability and economic growth that the country showed during 10 years, despite the erosion of democracy and human rights. And most importantly, during those 10 years, Ortega's strategy was very effective in turning a good amount of the public opinion against the role of journalists and human rights defenders. Why can't you let a good thing be? Finally, Nicaragua is at peace, it's stable, it's growing. And that gave way to a kind of Faustian bargain where people were happy to give up freedom in exchange for stability and exchange for economic growth.
So journalists were being portrayed as being sort of anti-national, were they?
More than anti-national, troublemakers who couldn't let a good thing be. But then, in 2018, due to several circumstances, the regime had to change from a dictatorship built on carrots to a dictatorship that relies on sticks. And when that happened, the attacks and the violence against journalism became very much more visible, but so did the public opinion change. So from 2018 on, the situation in Nicaragua is dire. It's a complete police state. The entire law system is against any kind of freedom. In practice, it's even worse than in the law. But public opinion has turned very quickly to support journalism, to support the work of human rights defenders, and that has allowed for, despite the complete dismantling of institutional democracy, for this last remnant of democratic exercise that has proven to be so resilient that it cannot be shut down or destroyed.
Thank you very much for that short introduction, Enrique, and we'll find out more about what you mean by resilience a little later on. Eddy, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the situation in Surabaya. It's a big city, I know that, 3.6 million inhabitants, faces a lot of challenges that many large Asian cities do. What's the role of the Voice of Surabaya, Suara Surabaya, your radio station, in helping people to address their challenges?
Yeah, we have problems, big problems in Surabaya, which are traffic and also public transportation. Because Surabaya is a city which has 3.1 million inhabitants at night, and it will be double at day because we have commuter people surrounding the area. We have also 2.8 million motorcycle and 500,000 car, and it creates a traffic jam in the city. And the problem become more serious because we never solve the problem about the public transportation. That's why in such a time, we face a very serious traffic jam. And the second one is flood. Flood is very serious things in Surabaya, especially in the last 2 years, because pandemic make us no budget from the central government to develop and also maintain the waterways. So
did you say that flooding is a very important problem?
Flooding. Okay. Also in the center of the city. That's because our mindset, because people throw the garbage in the waterways, and like I said before, the problems with the budget. That's the problems of our city, and we try to solve the problems by broadcasting the information first about the traffic report. We receive 800 to 1,100 call in every day. Most of them is traffic information. Some of them is like criminal information, or just want to talk, or they call us because they lost their kids, their pets, their car, and we broadcast the information so everybody can help everyone's problems.
Would you say that one more time, Eddy? How many people are calling in every day?
800 until 1,100 call in.
Every single day, wow.
One single day.
That is very impressive.
Yeah,
So you're providing a kind of social function then?
Yes, that's not include the WhatsApp chat and also the social media mentioned. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so tremendous reach. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I just want to bring in Meera now, Meera Chaudhry. Yeah, you're the co-leader for a project called VMES, Viable Media for Empowered Society, which has brought together media from Central America and Eastern Europe. It seems extraordinary. Why? Why have you done that? What have you achieved by bringing together such disparate media?
Hello, good morning, everyone. Yes, those media might seem very different because of their geographical locations, but when we organized an exchange meeting, not only with media from Central America and Eastern Europe, but also from other parts of the world, we realized that lots of these media actually face similar challenges and also were operating in circumstances that were also somewhat comparable. And they had such appetite for exchanging and understanding how each media found solutions to the things that they were battling with. So a project in which we looked at different ways of stimulating media viability, but also stimulating exchange and learning from peer-to-peer exchanges, was then set up in 2018 and turned out to be a very fruitful base, not only for the media, but also for other exchanges that came out of this program.
So can you give us some examples of the kind of learnings that have been able to be shared from these two very different regions?
They really come from very different angles. One is, for example, understanding how to operate within restrictive societies that sometimes become restrictive in a very short time. For example, when we started the project in 2018, the situation of the 8 countries in the project was very different than from how it is now. There were exchanges about how to work with a quickly deteriorating freedom. There is Nicaragua. Our colleague Enrique just explained how that was actually built up for a long time. There is Belarus. There is, of course, there's also Ukraine in there. So how to deal with your dictator, so to say, in different circumstances, but also how to deal with a dwindling audience, how to deal with critical audience, how to deal with less income from traditional revenue methods.
And journalists from very different regions have been able to share their experiences and help each other.
Yes, very much. As I said, it comes with very different circumstances, but it can also sometimes be about how to make sure that you have your personnel happy when everything around you is crumbling apart, to what is a new business model for your media outlet.
That's really fascinating. I see you nodding, Enrique, over there. Now, you were saying to us earlier that in 2018 everything changed, and the attitude of society changed, and both citizens and journalists became more resilient in the process. Tell us what you meant by that.
So basically, in 2018, structurally things changed again. And what that meant was that what was before an informal policy of attacking, of harassing, started to become very formal in practice and institutionalized through the entire law system. In the face of that challenge, resilience was not really an aspiration, it was just a necessity. And I think that the reason why I was nodding, listening to the story about VIMES, is because I remember quite clearly how, as early as 2019, like at the start of this crisis that is now going for more than 5 years in Nicaragua, it was amazing to start building partnerships organically with journalists and outlets from around the world, just exchanging, how did you deal with this problem? And adapting that for ourselves, and then also learning that the ways that we've dealt with problems were useful for other outlets from around the world. And honestly...
So what advice did you get?
I'll never forget, for example, the advice on how to build a network of basically clandestine reporters within a completely closed society, how to pair them with editors who are mostly outside of the country, how to have to take measures to even ensure that some of these people don't know each other. And I remember in 2018 thinking, well, we'll never get there, but let's plan ahead. And then before we knew it, we were there. So
and where did you get this advice from? May I ask?
I will not reveal the source.
Fair enough. That's a good journalist's answer.
But I'll tell you this. It was from colleagues from the African region who had to deal with this in the past. And then when the institutional framework in Nicaragua started to change with the cybersecurity law, with the foreign agents law, and these kinds of things, we immediately started to reach out to colleagues from Russia, from Ukraine, who had dealt, sorry, not from Ukraine, but from Belarus, who had dealt with these kinds of things. And we prepared for that from their experience as well. So honestly, I would say that that has been the most important pillar of Confidencial's resilience in Nicaragua, of Nicaraguan journalism in general, has been the ability to learn and to teach from journalists and media outlets from all over the world.
Thank you so much. That's really, really heartening to hear. Eddy, I wanted to ask you about something I read about Radio Surabaya, Suara Surabaya. It's called a social institute. What does that mean, a social institute? Why is a radio station something like a pillar of society?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, that our media, radio, is not just a media, but we are the hub and also the problem solver of the everything's or every single problems of citizens. So we try to more intimate to audience, you know, because radio has a power, intimacy, and also personal. So we try to try our best to close and personal to our audience. And due to that, we have some important information and also knowledge, and also we have data from the engagement. So the data, the information, the knowledge, we try to formulate, become such a theory perhaps, and the campus really likes to learn about the social changes, learning about the communication in Suara Surabaya media, because this is the real laboratorium in Suara Surabaya. All of our audience try to communicate with us and communicate each other, so we can learn about the pattern, the social pattern, and we make the concept. We make a whole new theory, perhaps.
Extraordinary that you're almost on the sort of the crossing point between journalism and academia.
Yeah,
almost.
A lot of campus learn in Suara Surabaya, so well as the students.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Learning is very much at the heart of what you're doing. And I wanted to ask you something similar to that, Mira. What you've created, a network in VMES, it's a kind of learning exchange, isn't it, in a way, between these two very different regions, different languages, different actual challenges, political on-the-ground challenges. Do you think you can scale this up to other parts of the world? Can we create an international network? What do you reckon?
I think that's very well possible. There's so much to learn from each other. Apparently, it seems that many states also follow a similar pattern of repression, so there's a lot to learn all over the world. The faces may be different, but the challenges people have to face are basically comparable. And also it's very energizing and uplifting to see that people all over the world have found solutions and have found also strength in learning from others who are in the same situation. So yes, it can be scaled up all over the world, and we who live in countries that are democracies can also learn and bring something to that exchange.
I wanted to particularly ask you about the safety of women.
Yes.
Because women journalists are particularly vulnerable and subjected to really awful, highly sexualized insults and threats, and their addresses are published, etc. It can be very victimizing. What can you do, and what have you learnt in your work to support women journalists?
Yeah, this is a very difficult phenomenon that you see all over the world. You see it with journalists, but you also see it actually with images of women that are used by journalists in the media. But yes, there are all kinds of ways that you can teach women journalists to be less vulnerable online. But what actually really should come here is understanding for audiences how important the role of journalists are, and that they are needed for democracy, so that they should not be seen as the bringers of bad news, that you can just insult and threaten through online, but also quite often in real life. There are all kinds of programs that we also as Free Press Unlimited have supported, but I think the most important thing is to understand that these people who actually work for information provision are not the scapegoats, are not the bringers of bad news, but very important pillars of democracy and information.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask Ruth to tell us a little bit about what Free Press Unlimited has done in, where is it, Moldova, Belarus? In the Balkan regions, to help. You come up to the stage where there's some light. And meanwhile, while Ruth is doing so, anyone wants to ask a question to our panelists, please start thinking about them. We have a mic, and you're very welcome to take part in this discussion. What have you been doing to help women journalists?
Right. Women journalists sadly are double hit because of their work, being a journalist, but also because of their gender. So we as Free Press Unlimited, indeed, as you mentioned, set up an in-person, tailor-made physical training program for women journalists. Tailor-made because they face in different regions also different challenges. On top of that, we also provide trusted networks for them to join so that they can share their information and experience. We set up specific online safety trainings, digital safety trainings for women journalists, free to access for everybody. And lastly, of course, we advocate for more and better regulation for women journalists in specifics.
Thanks, Ruth. Good to hear that. Would anyone like to put a question to our panelists? Please do feel free. Here you go. Please tell us who you are. And speak into the mic, thank you.
Perfect. Hi, Georg Jangiani, MGRC. I'm really happy to be participating in this one. Thank you for organizing. I was just making the notes actually about the Nicaragua, and I was fascinated with the question about, you told us about how public opinion has changed toward supporting the media, while they traded the idea of the peace against the freedom of access to the information or having the free press media. How did it happen? I'm from Eastern Europe. I'm really curious about this one. How did this happen? What played a major role here? Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah.
Enrique.
Thank you. Sure, thank you. So, I mean, there are several things that we have done and we continue to do to, perpetuate this happening, but I do think that we have to recognize at the very core that there is an aspect of it that is beyond our hands. And I think that has to do with the fact that when things are going well, criticism won't be so well received, but when things take a turn for the worse, then people recognize it. So maybe I'll use the analogy of, going to the doctor, going to the dentist, right? Nobody's looking forward to that until you really need it, unfortunately. So recognizing that, I think it's really important for media and journalists to challenge ourselves, to have no more ivory towers, to get off the high horse, to meet people where they are. And in the case of Confidencial, with what happened in 2018 in Nicaragua, that was seen by a deliberate change in editorial strategy to go from being exclusively narrative and investigative journalism tailored for decision makers from the country to doing also more news coverage and to challenging ourselves to find ways in a society that is one of the poorest in Latin America, that has one of the lowest levels and quality of formal education in Latin America, to really ask ourselves, how do we break these structural barriers so that journalism does not stay only amongst people who already believe in journalism, who already believe in accountability. And in the case of Confidencial, A lot of that has had to do with format, so relying very heavily on video, for example. But even beyond that, I think that one of the products that I'm most proud of is our political and satire. So the satirical news have really helped us break down socioeconomic barriers that we wouldn't have been able to break down otherwise.
And we've got another question for you from Leo from Kenya.
No, mine goes to the gentleman from Surabaya.
Please.
Basically, how do you deal with 800, you said it's 800 calls in a day?
800 to 1,000, Leo.
2,000, yeah. From a journalistic perspective, how does that affect the station or the media economically? Thank you.
Yeah, it happens because a lot of people who has problems in Surabaya, perhaps, yeah. Not only public matters, but also the private matters. You know, we frequently receive calls just to, people want to share anything, very private. And also from the public staff, we try to give us some problem solving. We doing news interactive and solutive.
I understand that when people call in with a problem, you ask them to come up with a solution as well. It's not enough just to complain. They also have to say, okay, and this is what needs to be done about it. Is that right?
Yes, because we believe in news interactive and solutive. News is the product. We using news procedure or journalistic procedure to validate the information from the public, and using interactive method as a communicative way, two-way communication, and also solutive. Solutive is the outcome of all the communication process. We believe on the system, and news interactive and solutive, we doing very strict to get trust, impact, and influence. Yeah, by the trust, we can broadening the impact, and also we can make more powerful with the influence. And we did it since 1983.
They know what they're doing, Leo. Thank you for your question. Well, dear friends and colleagues, I hope you've appreciated these examples that we've brought to you of resilience, of standing up for the role of journalists, of learning from each other and being supported by the citizenry of our countries. Shall we put our hands together now to thank Enrique Gasteazoro and the Eddy Prastyo and Meera Chaudhry.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure having you with us. So we're here to celebrate and analyze and learn from each other about how to strengthen the independence and viability of the media and independent voices. That is also a core European principle, a core European Union principle, I should say, and we're delighted to have received a message of support to that end for our meeting from European Commissioner for Values and Transparency, Vera Jourova. Let's just listen in to her.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Free Press Unlimited for organizing this event as part of the Summit for Democracy and for inviting me to say a few words. The summit is a great opportunity for democracies around the world to get together and try to tackle the challenges for our systems. Democracies face similar problems, and by working together, we have greater chances finding better answers. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine demonstrates that democracies need to stand together to defend their values. Today, I want to focus on one of the key pillars of any democracy: strong and independent media. Let me start by paying tribute to all the journalists risking their lives to inform us, in particular those who are today on the front line in Ukraine under Russian bombs. In democracies, journalists should be able to do their work without fear or favor, hold power into account, inform citizens so that they can make informed choices. And this is crucial, even more in times of war, even more in times of elections. This is why public authorities have a responsibility in creating the right conditions for journalists to do their work. In the European Union, we have made major steps over the past years. Most recently, we broke new ground with the Media Freedom Act. This proposal includes, for the first time in EU law, common safeguards to protect media pluralism and the editorial independence of the media. The Commission takes a clear stance that Member States can play an important role in providing funding to the media, but this should be done in a way that avoids pressure on the media and is fully fair and transparent. The Act also comes with a series of rules, for example, when it comes to state advertising, to ensure open and non-discriminatory procedures. The law is now being discussed by the European Parliament and among the Member States. We need to find an agreement soon, and I really count on your support. The Commission has also increased over the past years EU funding to the media sector. It mainly aims to support cross-border cooperation. One project is the European Newsroom, bringing together 16 agencies from all over Europe. The EU also supports a fund for investigative journalism. Direct grants are awarded by the International Press Institute. There is no doubt that without independent media, voters are in darkness and democracies are in decline. This is why we need to act, and we need to act fast. But there is one more thing, namely the trust in the media is declining, and the trust in conspiracy theories is on the rise. I don't think this is a coincidence. Our job as public authorities is to create the conditions for the media to flourish without fear or favor, and thereby build trust together. I wish you fruitful discussions on this very important issue.
EC Commissioner there, Vera Jourova. Member states can provide funding for the media, she said. Well, let's find out more about the role of states, shall we? We're going to broaden out our discussion to ask ourselves, what can states do to strengthen the resilience of independent media? Let me introduce you to Mira Milosevic, who is the Executive Director of the Global Forum for Media Development. Please come on up, Mira. It's the biggest global community of media development and journalism support organizations with over 200 members. Welcome. Lizzie Bans-Nobre is Deputy Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in the Netherlands. Welcome, Lizzie. And Christophe Deloire is Secretary General of Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders, I think I'll call it from now on, if you don't mind, Christophe. Welcome. So Mira, if I may start with you. We've just heard from Eddy, Enrique, and the other Mira about some of the challenges faced by independent media. Now, as a director of the Global Forum for Media Development, can you put this in context for us? You have a global membership. How widespread are these issues?
Thank you, Nisha. They're very widespread. If you look at the numbers around the world, when I started looking at media markets and news media, we estimated that around 65 to 70% of all media globally are small local community media organizations, and they were performing pretty much that social institute function that we heard an example from Indonesia, and they were providing information around the floods and traffic jams and accountability of local budgets and all giving voice to local communities. So that has been challenged everywhere, and the situation differs only as so far how difficult and how dangerous it is to be a journalist, or how precarious, how little you earn. And you can say that these challenges fall into three broad buckets. One is financial, the other is legal and safety, and the third one, of course, increasing each day is one of digital challenges in digital markets, where both the safety and survival in financial and every other sense are at stake. So I can go into a bit of a detail, but in all three buckets, of course, states, but also private sector, civil society, and academia can do a lot.
So specifically, tell me, what is the role of states, do you think? We were hearing earlier from the Commissioner, Vera Jourova. What is your take on what states can do to try and help the media survive in the face of these challenges?
Well, there are two things. We are here in the context of the Summit for Democracy and looking a lot at international development aid. Of course, there are a set of actions there in terms of increasing the assistance, and I can talk about the numbers a bit later. We are still at the 0.3% of overseas development assistance going to the media, which compared to other sectors is still very little. But that's not our major problem. Our major problem is that in that sector, assistance to media is not incorporated in other development programs. We also still don't see that the assistance is equitably and locally owned and driven. That's another thing. And most of it is still programmatic. Most of it is not actually supporting the core infrastructure and essential resilience of these organizations. But we heard just Madam Vice President of the European Commission talking about some of the initiatives they're taking, and a lot can be done inside of the countries. Even the most developed and democratic countries face challenges nowadays, and so she mentioned the European Media Freedom Act that has some of the elements that states can do. That includes the state advertising and public subsidies that need to be fairly and transparently allocated, for instance. You can speak about designated journalism as a charity role. You can speak about creating these grants. Jourova spoke about cross-border journalism and other grants, but this is still enough to sustain and support just a couple of organizations in each of the countries, especially those small markets. What we are really missing is that thriving market of local outlets, and that has almost disappeared in many countries.
Thank you very much, Mira. So that takes us on nicely to a question that I'd like to put to you, Lizzie van Nobre. The Netherlands, as co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition and one of the co-organizers of this year's Summit for Democracy, is committed to promoting press freedom in the Netherlands and worldwide. Is the viability of media that we've just been hearing about from Mira, is that a theme that you work on as well, the viability of media?
Yes. Well, good morning, everyone. Yes, media viability is definitely a topic that is high on the agenda of my government. Now, as already said, media freedom is a crucial element in a democracy, and the magnitude of challenges we've been facing over the last couple of years has put an immense pressure on journalism. So that is a reason for my government to decide 1.5 years ago to take up the position as co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition and the Summit for Democracy cohort on media freedom as well. And we're not doing that on our own. I must say we work greatly together with Canada on this topic. Now, the Media Freedom Coalition is a coalition of democracies. We are currently 51 states divided over 6 continents, and we all are very much committed to protect media and to advance the development of media. Now, maybe to make this a little bit more concrete is like, what do we do? Now, and this sounds maybe a little bit bureaucratic, but we have 3 working groups, and there's specifically one media working group on media development. And I think the strength of the working group is the combination. We work together with different kind of stakeholders, so it's civil society and it's member states. And what we do is we have a sort of a space where we exchange our experiences, our best practices. So that is really something we can learn from each other, we inspire each other. But what we also do, for example, is it's like a crucial bridge between states and other stakeholders, also including our diplomatic networks. So through civil society, we get a lot of information, and we can more or less instruct our embassies. Now, this is still something we are very much working on, but the strength is that there is the umbrella of the Media Freedom Coalition, which makes the position of the diplomatic missions stronger. And we've just developed a diplomatic toolkit for our embassy staff, which they can, well, it's like a practical guideline for embassy staff. And so we work together, and we are now starting to have some good examples of where we collaborate together, like, for example, in Mexico, in Indonesia. So I think, yeah, this is a way of how we try to express our commitment to media viability.
Thanks, Lizzie. Christoph,
Hi.
Hi, you've established the International Initiative on Information and Democracy. What is it? What's the purpose? And what has it got to do with the role of states?
I will use a metaphor related to sport.
Related to sport?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's consider that the marketplace for opinions, ideas, and facts is a sort of game. We, as press freedom organizations, we have to defend the players. I would say the best players, the ones who really comply with the definition of good journalism. But this is not enough that players are free, are alive, are not threatened. We also have to work on the rules of the game. The rules of the game are about the sustainability of the media, about how the market of media functions. This is why we have launched an initiative, another initiative, which is called the Journalism Trust Initiative, to give again a competitive advantage to quality journalism. Because in the current digital ecosystem, good quality journalism has a sort of competitive disadvantage. So first, the players, second, the rules of the game, and then third, the ground itself, the field where the players do play, and which is the digital space. And this field today is really trapped. In the past, our public spaces in our democracies were built on a national basis through constitutional guarantees, media regulation, invisible for the public but with many virtues. It was not perfect, but there were some virtues. And the building of the professionalization of journalism and self-regulation of journalism regarding ethics. It has been destroyed. Those safeguards are like swept away in a global information and communication space. And so we have to build a system of safeguards which is adapted to this globalized information and communication space. And this is what the Partnership on Information and Democracy is about. We have gathered governments which have signed an intergovernmental partnership built on a civil society declaration and with principles adapted to the challenges, the current challenges. Along with other stakeholders, including FPU, we have created a civil society-led implementation body, the Forum on Information and Democracy, with 2 pillars. First, evaluation, and we are currently creating the equivalent of the IPCC, the Observatory on Information and Democracy. Second pillar, recommendations to governments, like raw material for regulation, because even if Europe has adopted the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, it will not be enough. We have to really find new ways to regulate digital platforms to avoid that they keep these arbitrary powers that they have today.
And you think governments working together, establishing common principles and targets?
It's about having a good dialectics between civil society and governments based on very concrete recommendations. And we are about to create a task force with governments to work in common. We could say, oh, in the European Union, governments already work in common. No need. In fact, we need to go further. Plus, we need to also have other countries to be involved. And what we see for the moment is that we have, for instance, in the Global South, regulatory bodies. When they call Facebook, Google, and others, those companies do not even return the calls. For their parliaments, that's also very difficult. So that's also a question of supporting them to create the conditions for their democracies to be alive, to have democratic public spaces with some principles.
Yeah, and to have the kind of power to be able to negotiate and speak with the big media operators.
And for this, it is better to be part of a coalition of democracies. We have now 50 democracies in this coalition, 50 signatory states. The US, for instance, joined during the last summit on information democracy on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly last September.
So if you have more questions to put to Christophe on that, please take the opportunity. Meantime, Mira, I'd like to ask you about something I read about the Global Forum, that you're a vocal advocate for media development as a development priority for states. What does that mean, media as a development priority?
Well, I've just mentioned that states invest around 0.3% of their official development assistance into media. So the overall development assistance globally is around $135 billion per year. So it's a big commitment from different states around the world, mostly the most developed markets and economies, to support development priorities from hunger, health issues, climate change, to education of girls, for instance, and equitable technological development.
But it's a difficult issue, isn't it? At a time when we have climate change, we have women's issues, health issues, all clambering for that development funding, to say that media is also a priority.
What we are seeing, especially we've seen it through the pandemic, and we are seeing it with climate change, we cannot address any of these development priorities without information systems, without media and journalism that are actually bringing the agenda and bringing the information and bringing the conversations for us to find solutions for these problems. So that's not going to happen if we don't have journalism and media. And it's not going to happen if we only debunk and counter disinformation and narratives that have been set up by some clandestine operations and some, we call them malicious actors online, for instance. We really need to invest much more globally into producing high-quality accountability journalism, and journalism that also works with people, works with communities to put real issues on the agenda.
Very convincingly put. Thank you, Mira. So, Lizzie Bunsen-Aubrey, as our representative of a government here, can I ask you about this kind of dichotomy that despite the fact that democracies rely on good public interest journalism for their proper functioning, there is a kind of reluctance on the part of governments to support independent media directly. It's perceived as having conflicts of interest, perhaps problems with editorial independence. So what can states or governments do then to support independent media, either directly or indirectly?
Yes. I think, well, let me start by saying if we talk about support from states, we often immediately think on financial support, which is, of course, very important. But I think besides financial support, it's also important that states can support by creating an environment where media can flourish. Now, for media to flourish, it's necessary that, of course, there are trusted laws and trusted institutions, like in a well-functioning democracy. And unfortunately, because that is one of the reasons why we're sitting here today, this is not the case in every country in the world. So this is where the support from other states come in. Now, and I think you're absolutely right that there is a certain unease, I would say, between the relation of giving, for example, financial support and the independence of media. But there are ways to deal with that. Now, to give you an example, there are quite some states, and the Netherlands as well, we give financial support, but in an indirect way. So we make sure that there is a foundation or an institution in between the donor, so the state, and the media outlet that receives the money. And I think there are really...
It's still seen as foreign money, though, isn't it? Which can be problematical.
Yes, but well, this is how we work, and we do it we don't scream it out of the roof that we're doing this. So it's like an invisible way of giving the support. But I think it's so much necessary, both to protect the outlet that receives the money, but it needs the money because the government doesn't support them or even threats them. I've lived myself in other countries, and I see it's so much important that they do get the money, because otherwise they will just disappear. But we have to make sure that there is a neutral partner in between, and also not only because of their being independent, but also they are often threatened by the government. So if the government finds out that they receive money from elsewhere, they are at stake in this way.
I just want to get both your reactions to that. First Christoph, and then Mira. What about this funding from other governments to support independent media? Do you see that as potentially problematical? How does one manage that so that you do have independent voices, even though the funding may have come from outside?
We have developed a concept of a New Deal for journalism. We need societies to invest in journalism because of the social function that it represents. And of course, it's also based on the duties of journalists. Journalism is composed by both rights and duties. It's perfectly logical, and I fully share what Lydie just said, that governments invest, do fund, but another strategy is clearly also to create the conditions for journalism, for news and information media outlets, to really exist by themselves, fund themselves in the market. And so in this regard too, we have to help, we have to do this in democracies, in the northern countries, but also to support in the whole world that the media ecosystem is organized in a way that is appropriate for journalism to be funded. And that's not only about financial support, this is also through regulation and self-regulation. This is about how getting money from other actors, even digital platforms, because there is a capture of advertising by them, and this money that goes now to just a few companies is taken from media outlets, so we have to find ways to earmark again this money for journalism. And also, one of the key questions, I think for all those who want to support journalism, is how do we distinguish now journalism, media outlets that do produce journalism from other ones who produce disinformation, rumors, etc. And here we need a transparency about the processes are implemented in the media. And we need a scalable, non-discretionary mechanism, and this is what the Journalism Trust Initiative is about. This is why it is mentioned. I show the screen because I show Vera Jourova. This is now taken and quoted in the European Media Freedom Act. This is developed in many countries everywhere on all continents because it answers to this question, how do we distinguish journalism? Because there is no other way to support journalism than to first distinguish it from other types of sources.
Thank you. Mira?
Yes, 2 points, and this is a great question because I forgot to mention some of the great initiatives in the previous intervention, so thank you for this opportunity. So on the question of states funding for media, Global Forum for Media Development is a network of organizations that support media and journalism around the world. Those are professional organizations that actually are that link between, most of the time, between governmental giving and support to journalism. So they receive funding not only from one government, but from many. And they also have high professional standards and values. We also have codes of principles that all these organizations need to adhere to, and most of them have something called the do no harm principle. We also, as a network, advocate against instrumentalization of media for any purposes. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other is around the cooperation. So our network, the same as Summit for Democracy, Media Freedom Coalition, Information and Democracy Forum, has actually been set up because the resources that we all have are very limited. And so we need to cooperate to invest them to make that little money go further. And I'll give some of the examples that are coming up funded by that international assistance. Christoph, of course, is very good at explaining what RSF does, but there are some projects that have been launched, like Project Shield, that addresses this huge need of investigative and independent media organizations to address legal challenges that are huge. Then you have new initiatives to create support funds on international level, that's International Fund for Public Interest Media, where different countries invest, and that way, that money becomes more neutral. Other organizations do the same on the European level, including FPU and many organizations here, and we have increasing initiatives at the local level, where different governments come with philanthropy and local governments to set up funds, like the one being set up at the moment in Sierra Leone, for instance, with assistance from the BBC Media Action and the British government. And then finally, we have the private sector also cooperating increasingly with civil society and states. We have here a colleague from the OECD, where all the donors come together, share their data, standards, and practices, and we are now working together with the leads of the Media Freedom Coalition, especially the Media Development Working Group, and with the OECD colleagues, together with the GFMD network, to create new principles for effective media support fit for this day and age.
Thanks for laying it out for us, Mira. Anyone want to put a question to our panelists? I have the mic here. Just stick your hand up and I will beetle over to you with it. We have about 5 or 10 minutes to open out the discussion, so please do take the opportunity. It's now or never, dear friends and colleagues. Please, tell us who you are, sir.
My name is Suleiman Abrahima. I'm the Executive Director at the Media Foundation for West Africa. It's a comment and not a question.
Sure.
Where I come from, in West Africa, in many of the local languages, the word for democracy in Ghana, for example, is Kabima Min Kembi, which is literally translated as say some and let me say some. And then if you take the other languages, it's about the same. And for me, the critical enabler of that say some and let me say some is certainly the media. And so a clear symptom of a sick democracy is repressed media. So when you see the media are repressed, then certainly the democracy is sick, no matter the other manifestations. In terms of governmental support to the media, I would want to reiterate the point that was made, that yes, money is important, but the enabling environment is very critical. We currently have a situation in Guinea-Bissau, for example, where the government has decided to increase the licensing fee for television stations by over 7,000%, for radio stations by over 500%. And we are talking about from 10,000 to about 700,000 for television, and from $10,000, to about $16,000 for radio stations. This is a country with a GDP of less than 2 billion, per capita of less than 1,000. Media organizations operating making less than 3,000 or 4,000 income per month. So certainly this is a ploy by a government that says, look, I want to crush the media through a legitimate means. It's by law. If you can pay, operate. If you cannot, close down. And then perhaps the president and his allies can then set up their own to run the system. So the diplomatic community, these are some of the areas that we would sometimes need you to intervene in terms of your development assistance to countries like this, and to say, look, yes, we need a democracy, but the media is critical for democracy to thrive. Thank you.
Suleimana, thank you so much for your say-some. It was good to hear from you. And let's have a quick question here, and then a quick response from the audience, from this panelists.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Villima with Fondation Hirondelle. I have a question about your take on these international and yet very present media like Russia Today or CCTV, who present themselves as media with many of the qualification of a media and occupy the media space in many countries. How do you deal with them? What are your relationship with them? Thank you.
Who would like to take that? Who would like to respond to that slightly tricky question? Christoph.
I don't know if this is a tricky question, in fact, because this is media can be about independent journalism, propaganda, entertainment, whatever.
Plurality of voices.
So the question is, how do we define journalism? Can journalism be just under the orders of whatever power? Is it private or public or governmental? And the answer is, of course, not. In that case, this is not journalism. And clearly, for us, Russia Today, Sputnik, are media outlets that are absolutely not independent. So there are reasons for democracies to be protected in front of propaganda. In the past, of course, it was also possible for radio to cross borders with short waves, but it was really on the margins. Now it's so easy due to the technical evolutions and to the reduction of costs to produce contents that are propaganda contents, to send it in different languages all over the world, that it has an impact on democracies, and they have to find ways to address this. The European Union took sanctions, economic sanctions based on political decisions. Our opinion is that it's probably not the best way. We do not deny the legitimacy to take such decisions, but we do consider that they should be taken by independent bodies. This is, by the way, what the UK did with its regulatory body Ofcom. It wasn't the same decisions in the European Union, but there is a need for a new legal framework. And we have put on the table a very concrete project of a new legal framework, which is called the System for the Protection of Information for Democratic Spaces. This is based on a reciprocity mechanism, itself based on international standards for freedom of expression. And we have really, as democracies, when I say we, so I do speak as a citizen, to find ways to address these challenges of the globalization and look for and do our best for openness, but find ways to establish protections if needed. So first...
Christoph, I'm going to stop you there.
Sorry.
I'm just going to give Mira very short final words in response to that question, and then wrap up this discussion.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Caroline. That's a really, really important question. I couldn't agree more with everything that Christoph has just said, so I won't repeat that. I will just turn attention to the digital field, where these organizations actually are gaining even more traction and more power, as Christoph was pointing out. And what we are missing, and I agree, there are huge problems in creating the space for journalists and journalism in the digital field. So what is happening in the digital field at the moment is that organizations like Russia Today, CCTV, and other propaganda or misinformation and disinformation operations are given business tools, are given tools for amplification, tools for recommendations, tools for making money. And it's done at scale, whereas journalists and professional media organizations are in many cases not even recognized by these platforms. And I agree that tools such as Journalism Trust initiatives are crucial to work with platforms, not to not moderate media content and journalism per se, but to recognize these accounts and to have standards. And if you give business opportunity and business tools to entities online to scale and reach huge audiences, they need to adhere to a set of principles and standards.
A very good point, Mira. Shall we say a big thank you to Mira Milosevic, Lisa Van Snobre, and Christophe Deloire for helping us look at this question. Thank you very much indeed. The role of states and policy in helping independent media thrive and be resilient. We're now going to break up our meeting and break into a number of breakout groups. That's a lot of breaks in one sentence, isn't it, friends and colleagues? Well, these are our 3 priority areas for your breakout discussions. Our first working group is going to look at protecting journalists' safety. Working Group 2 is going to look at advancing freedom of expression. And Working Group 3 is going to look at what we've just been discussing, bolstering independent and diverse media, including financially and legally. So we have these 3 working groups. I would like to invite our working group leads now to take your members off into the breakout rooms, which are scattered around this hall, and we'd like to see you back in about an hour to share your recommendations with us. This is what we'd like to hear back from you. 3 recommendations on the way forward, 1 good practice example, make it tangible, and 3 goals for the short, the medium, and the long term. We're going to restart this plenary at 11:45 sharp, so if you're joining us online, that's the time to regroup. See you again at 11:45 sharp.
morning, Barry. I don't know if you can hear me.
Hello again. Welcome back to Thriving Media for Resilient Democracies. Dear friends and colleagues, we're going to hear back from our working groups who've been in the different breakouts what their recommendations are to move our subject and our agenda forwards. Joining us now is Matthias Kiesler from the German Foreign Ministry, who's going to be talking to us about the discussions from Protecting Journalist Safety Working Group. Catherine Anite, sitting in the middle, is from the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom and will be reporting back on the Advancing Freedom of Expression Working Group. And Mira Milosevic, who was with us in the plenary earlier, will be talking to us about bolstering independent and diverse media. And the first question I have for all three of you is, please share with us your main recommendations, anything from 1 to 3 recommendations. And let's ask you that first, Matthias Kiesler. How do we protect journalist safety better?
Yes, first of all, I would say we had a very lively debate in our working group. I think time was a little bit too short. We would have presented many more recommendations, and I would like to thank also my co-leads from IFEX and from ECOS, that they presented or prepared the report, and we received more than 51 pledges from different stakeholders. This is very impressive, and I would like to thank. But now, what recommendations we had? There were 2 key points or keywords. One was coordination, and the other one was enabling the environment. So we propose to foster coordination on different levels, on the level of state, between states and civil society and among civil society. It is important to include all stakeholders. So it's a multi-stakeholder approach. And we identified that it is very important to coordinate better on a local level, so on the ground. I think there's still a lot of things to do.
So let me interrupt you there. I didn't expect you to say that, Matthias. Why is that so important, coordination, in terms of protecting journalists' safety?
Because we want to work together, and without, at least there should be exchange of information. This is the minimum. Then on the next level, kind of coordination, and then maybe on the highest level, collaboration. So to make the work more effective. We appreciate very much, there are a lot of initiatives. I mentioned especially Media Freedom Coalition. It was presented this morning, a great job, but we feel, especially from the German side, we could do more on a local level, because they are the target group, they are the journalists. We have to talk with the journalists, with the civil society there to understand and to form institutions to work together. For example, it was mentioned in our group, it's not enough that the diplomatic community give money to projects. We have to raise our voices more clearly to governments in these countries. But we can do it only now when we talk to each other, when we coordinate, and then we can raise our voice. For example, when we see that the environment goes into the wrong direction, we could, for example, ambassadors come together as a joint démarche and to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Or when we see there are individual cases, we have to take care of it, and then we have to have the exchange. How can we help these persons?
Okay, thank you very much, Matthias Kiesler. Catherine Anite, what are the main recommendations of your working group, Advancing Freedom of Expression?
Firstly, I would like to thank the members of our working group for the robust discussion, and I agree the time was insufficient because there's a lot to discuss. If we look at the regulatory framework on advancing expression around the world, we're seeing more control rather than regulation, especially in the digital arena. So a lot of laws came through, but one thing that we identified is we're not seeing best practices coming through clearly. There's a lot of cut and paste of bad laws across the regions. So we would like to see states focus on the best practices and cherry pick the good legislative frameworks to advance freedom of expression. So we're looking at reforming these laws and also enacting laws that do not exist to protect the media and free speech. But in that process, we would like to see states not working in silos, working with civil society, working with media to enact these laws. And one of the best practices that we discussed in the group is recently we have had conversations with members of parliament, specifically the ICT and media committees, for example, from Tanzania. Last week I had a discussion with members of parliament from Ghana to just look at the laws on media freedom and freedom of expression. And for Ghana's case particularly, because it has been seen as a beacon of free speech in Africa, but in the last 1 year, when you look at the RSF report, Ghana has dropped 30 places, and that has never happened in the past 20 years. So the question to the members of parliament and the ICT committee of Ghana was, why are we seeing this drop? Why is Ghana no longer the beacon of freedom of expression and media? And it was a concern that, you know, they had sort of held their country in high regard in terms of giving hope to other countries in Africa to look at them as a best practice. So now what we are looking to do is to try to see how Ghana can regain its spot.
Yeah, it is astonishing how quickly things can change,
yeah,
as we heard in the plenary earlier. Mira Milhosevic, what are the recommendations from your working group on bolstering independent and diverse media?
Thank you, Nisha. And if you don't mind, I will first say a couple of words about our media cohort and all 3 working groups and the process that we've been through over the last, different groups have worked differently, but from 3 to 6 months. So it's been a very short period, and it hasn't been a process that didn't have its struggles. But we were all fortunate to cooperate both with governments of Netherlands and Canada and Internews as the leads of the media cohort. And they have corralled all of us together into 3 working groups. And working group 1, our colleagues from German Foreign Ministry have already mentioned ACOS Alliance and IFAX. They have done tremendous work. Working group 2, a high-level legal panel, but also government of Liberia came together to collect not only commitments, but really to look at what civil society has been doing over the years. And for us in the working group 3, we brought our Global Forum for Media Development community, but also different partners from the sector with the support from the US government and the UK government. And it was a lot of back and forward, but we also had support from the Media Freedom Coalition, and a big shout out to Derek here from the Secretariat, who have tried to understand all these threads and come together with a report where Internews has played a crucial role. So I thought this was a unique opportunity to say that. On the recommendations, of course, in the report we have many recommendations. We also have different reports like yours from high-level panel. So it was very difficult. We structured it into 3 areas: recommendations for governments, recommendations for tech and private sector, but also recommendations for media companies. We were given also the task to have some of the best practices. And I think for us, 2 threads that go through everything is support for civil society to be resourced and to address challenges such as digital that are appearing, but on the behalf of public interest and small media organizations. So one of the threads was that big media organizations in many markets have actually benefited from everything that was happening, and they have a channel to communicate both to platforms and the governments and their audiences, whereas small media organizations have been affected the most. So one of the main recommendations is to support more civil society to participate in, equally in this fora, but also to support civil society to be able to represent public interest, small, medium community organizations. So that's on that end. In short term, one of the things was to ask all the politicians not to attack journalists and media. That's very easily achieved. Then, well, yes, if they have a political will. In the midterm, we talked about neutrality of money and how to tap into different areas of development assistance. So one of the recommendations is to increase media sector support to 1% of development assistance, but also tap into other areas of the development assistance. So that's for the governments and international organizations. For the tech companies, it's to invest more into understanding local context and to provide contact and resources and incentives for journalism, media organizations, civil sector, human rights defenders to have the approach, and to media outlets themselves to create associations, to create bodies that will be able to represent the sector properly in different fora and different policy discussions. So I'm trying to summarize. And then the good practices examples.
I'll ask you in a second.
Yes.
I want to just pull Matthias into that. We heard from Catherine a very good practice, the engagement with parliamentarians in Ghana. Can you give us an example of what you think is a good practice in terms of enhancing the safety of journalists?
I will give you the answer, but I would like to come back to the first question because I mentioned only one recommendation.
Okay,
it was
go on.
Coordination, and the other one, which we discussed very thoroughly, it was that we should assist in creating and ensuring an enabling environment. So we had 4 propositions. For example, work on having progressive legislation, promoting trust in journalism, including working on regulations on tech platforms, and to make media more resistant and resilient. So these are general terms, but it will help that journalists will be protected and give them a better and a safer environment. So a practical example, yes, we didn't, as I mentioned, we received 50-something pledges, so we did not discuss it in details, all these proposals. But if I can take now another hat, I'm now here represent the working group, but at the same time I represent the German government. I presented to the group the Hannah Arendt initiative. This is an initiative to protect individual journalists. Somehow it is, we don't want to do it alone. Of course, it's a German project, but we feel when it comes to coordination, when we think about it to extend the program. At the moment, we concentrate on Afghanistan, on Russia, and Myanmar in future. We would see more regions be involved, and then we have to think about it, how can we work with other stakeholders. I was in Paris 2 weeks ago with UNESCO, and we found some common grounds, what we could do together. I see a lot of work by the Dutch government in this field. We will continue talking with the Dutch government. So we take something out of this meeting that, again, coordination, exchange of information is very important to us.
Great, thank you, Matthias. So, Catherine, you were telling us about your work with the Ghanaian parliamentarians. Are you going to expand that to other areas? How do you see this moving forward? What are your goals, short, medium, and long term?
Well, just to follow through with my colleague here, the underlying theme here is progressive legislation, and that includes robust participation both from civil society, media, and policymakers. So many times civil society has separate discussions, and the recommendations that policymakers who are normally not in the room, but we realize that when you bring these 2 groups together, there is quicker implementation of those recommendations. So the discussion now is, how do we progress this legislation? So the recommendation to states is to implement this with an understanding of international and normative standards. So a lot of times we don't see Article 19 of the UDHR or ICCPR reflected in those laws. So the emphasis would be, while these legislators enact these laws, they have a clear understanding of international frameworks. And that means that states need to capacitate their members of parliament, or policymakers, and the civil society to advocate for good laws as well. again, accountability for these violations. You know, we may have all the good laws, but if we don't have accountability, then, I mean, the discussion is incomplete. So we want to see states, you know, account for violations of media freedom and freedom of expression. And finally, also for the platforms, we need to see human rights concerns incorporated in content moderation. And that also means coordination, collaboration, bringing all the voices together. Definitely, we will continue to engage policymakers. Like I said, in Ghana, we've done that. In Tanzania, there's a new political dispensation, and there's political will. So it's a good sort of entryway for civil society, for organizations, for the high-level panel, Media Freedom Coalition, to go into Tanzania to advocate for change. As you know, previously, there was a ban on newspapers. There was a ban on political rallies, which was lifted early this year. The ban on newspapers was also lifted. So that's a very good way to enter into Tanzania and advocate for laws. Liberia, which is the chair of this working group, has previously, you know, legislated on privacy laws, and we've supported them, members of parliament, into incorporating best practices and international standards into those laws. And I think there's scope for all of us to work with legislators across the world to capacitate them to be able to draft laws that we can be proud of, laws that media can be proud of, and also bringing media into the conversation. In my group, we're discussing that if you went to journalists and asked them what are the 5 critical laws that govern your work, many times they may be able to mention just the Constitution, and they won't be able to identify the critical laws. So if journalists do not understand their operational environment, the legal and regulatory framework, how do we advocate or advance their rights? We need to bring them into the conversation. Civil society does most of the work for them, but now it's time to bring the media into the conversation.
Very obvious point you made there, but thank you, it needed to be said. And Mira Milosevic, you were going to give us an example of what good practice might look like when it comes to bolstering independent and diverse media.
Yes, but just to say that this is the point that was raised also in our group, that media need to be at the table, but also given the support, because those are small organizations that don't have capacity to follow that. But yes, we need to tell our story a bit better and to a wider audience. I think that thread of collaboration and coordination came through with all the kind of best practice examples that we were getting. And I'll mention just some where media, civil society, private sector, and with the support from governments, international organizations are coming together and are able to engage networks such as projects that Media Foundation in West Africa does, such as Innovative Cyber Media Association in Indonesia that is addressing really together, so media coming together to address challenges of the big tech. We mentioned Sierra Leone Fund for Public Interest Media. That is because of that capture threat actually being driven by the civil society in cooperation with the national authorities. And then we have other associations that have managed then collaborations to address some of the challenges of that environment. And finally, not to take more time, the big issue of how to learn from what we do and how to share effectively and how to have more of these occasions. I have to say that this year is particularly challenging for us coming together because all the major meetings around the media freedom this year are closed in nature by invitation only. And both the, I mean, for rational and logical reasons, but still, we don't have many opportunities to bring wider civil society, media, to have a conversation this year. And this is really needed. For us to be able to respond to these challenges, we need to be able to see each other. Now we have opportunity after 3 years. And so I will close with calling government, civil society, and all the organizations to provide more opportunities for people from all around the world to come together, share, learn, and create coordination and joint action.
Well, this is a first positive step in that direction. Mira Milosevic, Catherine Anite, and Matthias Kiesler, thank you so much for reporting back from the 3 working groups to us.
Our pleasure.
So, our meeting is drawing to a close now. I hope you feel that it has been an important first step in getting the conversations going again. What Mira Milosevic said is so vital. And I'm going to hand over now to our host, Ruth Kronenburg from Free Press Unlimited, for some final words and some closing thoughts. Ruth.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for your active participation. The closing remarks and recommendation are so valid. I will not repeat them because they said it much better than I can do. But I do want to stress that I sincerely hope that all the actors present here, both states as well as private sector and the civil society, will take upon these recommendations and bring them forward, because it is very necessary, as we have witnessed and heard about this morning. So thank you very much. Also, the participants online, thank you very much for joining us. We know that you had so many questions, and we will get back to you separately on all the questions online that we have heard. There is a network lunch for everyone who's present here. You're all invited. Rest to say to all of you, thank you very much. Let's bring this forward and let's do it. Thank you.